3 days before my wedding, my father, Colonel Harold Calloway, United States Army, retired, called me at 11:40 at night and said he would not walk me down the aisle. My mother, Diane, took the phone from him and said it plainer. Walk alone. Your sister feels overshadowed. I was 31 years old, a major with 19 years of service behind me, a silver star I had never once mentioned at a family dinner, and I said only one word back to her. Fine, my own voice flat and level, the same exact voice I once used to call in a 9-line medevac request under fire, because I had already decided, before she finished the sentence, exactly how the next 4 days were going to go, and none of it involved asking either of them to change their minds. If you're new here, comment the state or country you're watching from, and if you've ever had a parent choose comfort over you, on the one day you needed them most, hit like and subscribe before the doors of that chapel open, because what walked me down that aisle instead made 3 generals stand up and salute a bride. That phone call was the first loop, and it would not close for a long time. The second loop opened 4 hours later, back at my apartment, when I opened a locked grey filing box I had kept sealed since 2011, and looked, for the first time in years, at a stamped envelope marked secret. No fawn, the kind of paper that does not leave a facility without a 2-star signature. I did not open it that night. I put it back in the box and locked it again, and I told myself it was for another day, a day I could not yet see, a day that would come 9 years later in a courtroom instead of a chapel. The third loop opened the morning of the wedding itself, when Master Sergeant Tony Reyes, the only man from my old medevac team still speaking to me by name and not by rank, knocked on my hotel room door in his dress blues and said, "Ma'am, your father isn't walking you, but you are not walking alone, and I am not the only one who's going to be standing when you come through those doors." I did not know yet what he meant. I would understand it in about 4 hours, and it would take my family another 11 years to understand it at all. I remember the exact weight of the veil in my hands that morning, the specific cold of the hotel room air conditioning against my bare shoulders, the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears, louder than it had any right to be for a woman who had once sat perfectly still through mortar fire. I remember thinking, with the same clinical detachment I had trained into myself over a decade of service, that whatever walked through those chapel doors in 4 hours would be the truest version of my family I had ever seen, stripped of every polite fiction we had all agreed to maintain for years, and that I would need to be steady enough to watch it happen without flinching, because someone in that room was finally going to have to. My name is Rebecca Ann Calloway. For 19 years I told people I did logistics. That was true, the way a locked door is true, accurate, and completely useless as a description of what was behind it. I coordinated medical evacuation under fire in Kandahar province in the spring of 2011, and again outside Mosul in the winter of 2016, and in between those 2 deployments, I sat through 11 Thanksgivings where my father, a colonel who had never once left a stateside desk in 31 years of service, introduced me to his old army friends as his daughter who does paperwork for the government. I let my mother tell her book club I worked in administration. I let my sister Emily, 4 years younger and married to a cardiologist by 26, roll her eyes when I said I couldn't make it home for Christmas because I was, quote, filing things. I let all of it happen because the work I actually did came with a classification level higher than my father's old motor pool clearance, and because the 2 men I pulled out of a burning miserpap outside Kandahar in April of 2011 were worth more to me than any dinner table correction. I was not humble. I was disciplined. There is a difference, and almost nobody in my family ever learned it. My relationship with the truth of my own service started long before Dean Whitfield walked into it, but Dean is where the second half of this story lives, so let me put him in the room now, exactly the way he put himself into my life in the fall of 2013, 2 years after Kandahar, 1 year before the wedding my parents almost skipped. Dean was 34, an associate at a mid-size firm in Charlotte called Whitfield and Marsh, a firm his own father had co-founded, which meant Dean had never once in his adult life needed to be good at his job to keep it. He was tall, well-dressed, quick with a joke at a bar, in the way that reads as confidence, until you've watched him negotiate anything that actually mattered, and seen him fold the second real pressure arrived. I did not see that folding for years. What I saw, in 2013, was a man who laughed at the right moments and asked good questions about my work, without ever once asking the follow-up question that would have told him what my work actually was. I found that restful. I did not yet understand it was avoidance dressed up as respect. We married on a Saturday in June of 2014, in a chapel outside Fort Bragg with 210 guests, 40 of them wearing some form of a military uniform, 6 of them wearing stars on their shoulders. My father did not walk me down the aisle. Tony Reyes did, in his dress blues, and when we crossed the threshold of that chapel, the officer seated in the third row on the left, Brigadier General Marcus Webb, my old task force commander from Kandahar, stood without being asked and saluted. 2 more generals in the row behind him rose a half-second later and did the same, because that is what happens when the room understands something the bride's own father does not. My mother's face, I am told, did not move for 11 full seconds. My father's did not move at all. Dean, standing at the altar in a rented tuxedo, smiled the confused, charmed smile of a man who has just been handed a piece of theatre he does not understand is not theatre, and later that night, at the reception, he asked me, laughing, what that salute thing was even about, some army tradition or something. I told him it was nothing. That was the first of many times I would decide, on purpose, that Dean did not need to know the whole truth to love me. I was wrong about that math for 11 years. For a long time the marriage worked precisely because Dean never asked the second question. I retired medically in 2019 after a blast injury outside Mosul left me with a titanium plate in my left forearm, permanent hearing loss in one ear, and a cardiac arrhythmia. The VA cardiologist, Dr. Amelia Foster, would later describe in a sworn deposition as, quote, a direct and documented consequence of repeated blast wave exposure, closed quote. I came home to Charlotte with 19 years of service, a retirement rank of Major, a Silver Star, a Bronze Star with Valor Device, a Purple Heart, and a monthly retirement check of $4,211 before VA disability, which added another $1,640 on top of it. Dean's mother, Constance Whitfield, met that number at a family dinner in the spring of 2019, with a small, precise smile and the words, well, that's certainly more than nothing, isn't it? Delivered in the exact tone she used for waitstaff, she considered adequate but replaceable. It was the first of what would become dozens of moments over the following 6 years, in which Constance made her contempt for me sound like a compliment with the pin still in it. There is a texture to that kind of household contempt that I think people who haven't lived inside it tend to underestimate. It is not loud. It does not announce itself as cruelty, which is exactly why it survives so long uncorrected. It arrives in the specific weight my mother-in-law put on the word career, the way some people put weight on the word allegedly. It arrives in the particular silence that follows when you mention, in passing, a name like Kandahar or Mosul at a dinner table, and someone changes the subject to the weather, with a speed that tells you the change was rehearsed. I learned to read that silence the way I once learned to read the specific stillness of a room seconds before incoming fire, a comparison I have never once said aloud in 11 years of marriage because I already knew, before I even tried, exactly how it would be received. It would be received as drama. It would be received as me, once again, making my ordinary Tuesday into something operatic. So I kept it. I kept the comparison the same way I kept the sealed envelope in the grey filing box, in a place nobody was looking, waiting for a day I could not yet name. Constance Whitfield had one setting, and she never left it. Superiority delivered as concern. At my son Jacob's 9th birthday party in 2021, she told the other mothers, within my hearing, that it was, quote, so brave of Dean to have married a woman with such an unconventional career, considering how much stability a child really needs, closed quote. At Thanksgiving in 2022, she asked me, in front of 11 relatives, whether the VA had ever, quote, actually confirmed anything was wrong with me, or whether it was more of a, and here she paused, for exactly as long as it takes to make a room uncomfortable, a paperwork thing. I did not raise my voice. I have never once raised my voice at Constance Whitfield in 11 years, and I believe that silence unsettled her more than shouting ever could have, because shouting she could categorize, silence she could not. Dean's father, Robert Whitfield, died in 2020, and the firm passed to Dean 2 years earlier than anyone in that family expected, which is the exact kind of sentence that explains everything else that happened afterward. Dean at 34 had been a competent associate riding his father's name. Dean at 40 was the managing partner of a 14-attorney firm, with no one left above him to catch his mistakes, and he made several, the largest of which was a malpractice exposure on a construction defect case in 2022 that cost the firm $190,000 in a settlement Dean kept from me for 14 months. I did not learn about that settlement from Dean. I learned about it from a forensic accountant named Priya Nair, hired much later by my own attorney, who found the wire transfer buried under a line item labeled, with a lack of imagination I still find almost funny, consulting fees. Dean was not a confident man who had built something. Dean was a frightened man standing on something his father built, watching it list slowly to one side, and increasingly certain that the only asset in his life large enough to sell off and steady the ship was me. I want to be precise about the timeline here, because precision is the only thing that eventually saved me. In March of 2024, I began experiencing episodes of tachycardia and lightheadedness, severe enough that Dr. Foster ordered a cardiac event monitor, a small device I wore, clipped to my bra strap for 30 days, recording every irregular beat for a Holter analysis. I told Dean about the monitor. I did not make a production of it, because I have never in my life made a production of anything involving my own body, and Dean, to my lasting and specific disappointment, filed that information away, not as a fact about his wife's health, but as a fact he could later use against me. In April of 2024, Dean filed for divorce. He did not tell me in person. I received a certified letter at the house, forwarded through Bradley Simmons, Esquire, of the firm Simmons & Cole, citing, among other things, irreconcilable differences, and, in a footnote I read 4 times before I fully understood what he was doing, a request that the court consider, quote, the physical and occupational limitations of the wife in determining custodial and spousal support arrangements, close quote. Dean was already building a file on my body before he had told me our marriage was over. The custody stakes were our son Jacob, 14 at the time of the filing, and, in a detail the court took more seriously than I expected, our 9-year-old golden retriever, Scout, whom Jacob had trained himself for a 4-H obedience competition and refused to discuss losing. The financial stakes were the marital home on Providence Road, appraised at $685,000, Dean's 40% partnership stake in Whitfield and Marsh, and, most significantly to Dean personally, my military pension and the survivor benefit plan election I had made in his favor back in 2015, worth, according to actuarial testimony, later given by a court-appointed valuator named Harold Kim, approximately $310,000 in present value if it survived the divorce, and effectively zero if the court terminated it. Dean's opening settlement demand, delivered by Bradley Simmons on June 3, 2024, sought 50% of my pension as marital property, full termination of the SBP in his own favor as a lump sum buyout instead, and primary physical custody of Jacob, on the stated grounds that, and I am quoting Bradley Simmons's own filed brief here, because I have read it more times than any document in my life, the wife's documented medical conditions, including a cardiac arrhythmia and a history of combat-related psychological evaluation, raise legitimate concerns about her capacity to provide a stable, full-time home. I want to sit inside that sentence for a moment, because it is the hinge the entire rest of this story turns on. Dean Whitfield, who had never once in 11 years of marriage asked me a single follow-up question about what happened to me in Kandahar or Mosul, who did not know the name of a single soldier under my command, who could not have told you what medevac stood for if you had offered him $100 to guess, decided in the spring of 2024 that the safest legal strategy available to him was to take my service and my body and turn them into a liability large enough to buy him out of an unhappy marriage cheaply. He was not wrong that it was a strategy. He was catastrophically wrong about what he was actually holding when he picked that particular weapon up. The sealed grey filing box came back into my life on the evening of June 3, 2024, the same day I received Bradley Simmons's opening brief. I drove to a storage unit off Independence Boulevard that I had paid $19 a month to maintain since 2015, without ever once opening the door, and I sat on the concrete floor of Unit 214 with the box in my lap and looked at the secret, no-fawn envelope for the second time in 13 years. Inside it was the after-action report from the Kandahar mission in April of 2011, an operation that had, at the time, been classified for reasons having nothing to do with me and everything to do with the identities of 2 coalition pilots I had helped extract from a downed helicopter under sustained small arms fire, an extraction that earned me the Silver Star and that had remained, by law, sealed for over a decade. I did not know, sitting on that concrete floor, whether the report could ever be unsealed for a civilian family court proceeding. I knew only that it existed, that it said, in the government's own cold language, exactly who I had been at 29 years old, while my husband was billing $340 an hour to draft the paperwork that would try to make me disappear at 42. I called Colonel Grace Okafor early the next morning. Grace and I had served together for 2 years at Bragg, before she left active duty for law school in 2009, and built, over 15 years, one of the more formidable JAG-adjacent family law practices in North Carolina, specializing almost entirely in divorces involving service members and their pensions. Grace listened to the entire situation without interrupting me once, which is a habit I have always respected in people, and then she said the sentence that became the spine of my defense for the next 11 months. "Rebecca," she said, "they are trying to use your silence as a weapon, and the only way to disarm a weapon like that is to stop being silent at the exact moment it will do the most damage, not one moment before. We are not filing that report tomorrow. We are filing it last." Grace's strategy required patience. I did not always feel I had. Between June of 2024 and the final hearing in May of 2025, I sat through 4 separate depositions, 3 mediation sessions that went nowhere by design, and one particularly grim afternoon in August of 2024, when Bradley Simmons asked me, under oath, to describe in detail the nature of my, quote, combat-related psychological evaluation, closed quote, a phrase that referred to a single, entirely standard post-deployment mental health screening every service member undergoes as a matter of routine policy, and that Dean's legal team had somehow transformed, in 11 months of filings, into language suggesting instability. I answered every question in the same flat, unhurried voice I have used my entire adult life. I did not cry in that deposition. I did not raise my voice. Bradley Simmons, I noticed, seemed almost disappointed by how little material my composure gave him to work with, and he tried a different angle before the session ended, asking whether I agreed that a woman with, quote, my medical history, closed quote, might reasonably be seen as less equipped to handle the stress of full-time parenting than a managing partner at a respected law firm. Grace objected. The court reporter kept typing. I looked directly at Bradley Simmons and said, "I have coordinated medical evacuations under direct enemy fire, while responsible for the lives of 11 soldiers at once. I am fairly confident I can handle a 14-year-old's homework schedule." Grace told me later that was the moment she stopped worrying about how I would hold up in front of a judge, and started worrying instead, quietly, and with something close to satisfaction, about how Bradley Simmons was going to hold up, once the rest of the record finally caught up with the sentence he had already put in writing. The secondary antagonists in this story earned their places through repetition, not through any single dramatic act, and I want to give them their due, because contempt of this specific kind rarely announces itself loudly. It accumulates. Constance Whitfield's second defining moment came in September of 2024. At a mediation session she had no legal standing to attend, but showed up to anyway, sitting in the waiting room until Dean invited her in during a break, where she told me, in front of both attorneys, that she had always found it, quote, a little sad, closed quote. That I built my entire identity around a career that, quote, most people don't even understand or particularly respect, closed quote. And that perhaps this divorce was an opportunity for me to, quote, finally figure out who I am outside of all that. I said nothing. Grace wrote something on her legal pad and slid it across to me later. It said, she just testified, on the record, that your service defines you. Thank her for that later. Constance's third moment, the one that finally exhausted whatever patience I still had left for her particular brand of concern, came at Jacob's freshman orientation in August of 2024, 3 months after Dean filed. She approached me near the refreshment table, took my hand in both of hers, in a gesture that looked, from 6 feet away, like tenderness, and said, quietly enough that only I could hear it, that she hoped I understood none of this was personal, that she had simply always believed a child needed, quote, a certain kind of consistency that some lifestyles simply don't allow for, closed quote entirely, and that she truly said this, she wanted me to know, out of love for Jacob rather than any judgment of me. I thanked her for her honesty. I did not thank her for anything else, because there was nothing else in that sentence worth thanking her for, and I have found, over 19 years of dealing with people who mistake their own certainty for kindness, that the fastest way to end a conversation like that is to simply agree with the one true thing buried inside it, and let the rest sit there, unclaimed, in the silence that follows. Vanessa Doyle entered the story formally in October of 2024, though I had suspected her presence for close to a year before Dean ever confirmed it. Vanessa was 29, a paralegal at Whitfield and Marsh for 3 years before she became, in the language of the eventual settlement documents, Dean's cohabitating partner. Vanessa's defining trait was a specific, performed calculation dressed up as warmth, the kind of person who says something cruel, with a smile soft enough that you spend a full minute afterward wondering if you misheard her. At a custody exchange in October of 2024, standing in the driveway of the house I had lived in for a decade, Vanessa told me, smiling, that she just thought it was important for Jacob to have, quote, some stability and consistency in his life right now, given everything, closed phrase she left conspicuously unfinished, everything doing a great deal of unspoken work. I asked her, in the same flat tone I used with Bradley Simmons, to be specific about what she meant by everything. She did not answer. She has never, across the entire 18 months of this story, answered a direct question I have put to her. A second instance came in January of 2025. At a school event Jacob had asked both of us to attend separately, where Vanessa positioned herself near the entrance well before I arrived, and greeted every parent who walked in with a warmth so calibrated it read almost as choreography. And when I finally reached her, she said, smiling the same soft smile, that she'd heard about my little health scare from Dean and hoped I was, quote, taking it easy, closed quote. A phrase delivered with just enough emphasis on little that I understood exactly what she meant to do with it, which was to make my documented cardiac condition sound, in front of 3 other parents, like a minor inconvenience I was perhaps overstating. I told her, in the same flat tone I have used for every version of this sentence in this story, that I was following my cardiologist's exact instructions, and that I appreciated her concern, and I watched her smile hold perfectly steady, while something behind her eyes recalculated. Bradley Simmons's own defining moment did not stay contained to a single hallway remark either. In a deposition in November of 2024, he asked me directly whether I believed my, quote, prior occupation, closed quote, had left me with what he called, and I remember the phrase precisely because Grace underlined it twice in her copy of the transcript, an inflated sense of my own victimhood that might be, quote, coloring my account of the marriage, closed quote. I answered that I had spent 19 years being told my occupation was paperwork, and that if anything, I had spent most of my adult life deflating rather than inflating any account of what I had done, and that I found it curious he assumed the opposite without ever once asking a single specific question about what that occupation actually involved. Bradley Simmons's defining trait was a specific brand of professional arrogance that mistook procedural aggression for skill. He filed 11 separate motions between April of 2024 and March of 2025, several of them, in Grace's professional assessment, entirely unnecessary and designed primarily to run up my legal fees in the hope that I would eventually settle, simply to make the bleeding stop. In February of 2025, in a hallway outside courtroom 4 of the Mecklenburg County Family Court building, Bradley Simmons said to Grace, loud enough that I heard every word from 6 feet away, that he didn't understand why I was fighting so hard to protect a pension for, and I am quoting him exactly, because Grace wrote it down within the hour, in a contemporaneous memo that later became relevant. Quote, a woman who was never really a soldier, just an admin who got lucky with a medal somewhere along the way. Closed quote. Grace did not respond to him in that hallway. She looked at me instead, and I saw something settle in her expression, the particular stillness of a person who has just been handed the exact sentence she needed and knows precisely where to put it later. That sentence did not stay buried in a hallway. It came back, 11 weeks later, in a courtroom, out of a mouth that was not Bradley Simmons's own, and it landed harder the second time than it ever could have landed the first. If you have made it this far and you know exactly what it feels like to have your worth measured out loud by someone who never once asked you what you actually did, I want you to like this video right now, because what happens in the next 20 minutes is the part where every single person who said a version of that sentence finds out, in public, in real time, exactly how wrong they were. Dean's cruelty, when it finally arrived at its sharpest point, did not arrive as an accusation about my career at all. It arrived on a Tuesday morning in March of 2025, 3 days after a follow-up cardiac event caused me to collapse in the parking lot outside the Mecklenburg County Courthouse, a genuine loss of consciousness lasting approximately 40 seconds, witnessed by 2 courthouse security officers, and captured, unfortunately for Dean, on the building's exterior security cameras. I was taken by ambulance to Atrium Health Carolina's medical center, where Dr. Foster confirmed a sustained ventricular arrhythmia consistent with my documented blast exposure history, and where I spent 1 night under observation before being released with an adjusted medication regimen. Dean did not visit the hospital. Dean did not call. What Dean did, within 18 hours of my collapse, was authorize Bradley Simmons to file an emergency motion requesting an expedited custody hearing, arguing that my, quote, apparent medical episode, closed quote, whether genuine or, and this is the exact phrase from the filed motion, strategically timed to elicit sympathy from the court, demonstrated the urgent need to resolve custody before any further, quote, unpredictable incidents, closed quote, could affect Jacob's stability. My own husband filed a motion in writing suggesting, on the record, that I had faked cardiac arrest for legal leverage, 40 hours after I had genuinely lost consciousness on courthouse pavement. I read that motion sitting up in a hospital bed with an IV still taped to the back of my left hand, and I want to tell you honestly that it was the only moment in this entire 18-month process where I felt something crack, not from fear, and not from grief exactly, but from a specific, clean kind of clarity, the sensation of watching the last possible excuse you were making for someone finally run out of road. I had spent 11 years deciding, again and again, that Dean did not need to know the whole truth about who I was in order to deserve my loyalty. I understood, in that hospital bed, reading his attorney's characterization of my own body's failure as a legal maneuver, that I had been protecting a man who would have sold the truth about my collapsed lung function to a judge for a $50,000 advantage in a pension dispute, and that the protecting had never once been reciprocated, not for a single day of 11 years. Grace arrived at the hospital 40 minutes after I called her, sat down in the chair beside my bed, read the motion once, and said quietly, for the first time in this entire process, that we were done being patient on the medical question specifically. Dr. Foster's full deposition, the Holter monitor data, and the hospital's own cardiology report would all be entered as evidence. and Dean's motion, in trying to weaponize my collapse, had just handed us the exact opening we needed to make his cruelty the center of the courtroom instead of a footnote in it. The final hearing was scheduled for May 14, 2025, in Courtroom 4 of the Mecklenburg County Family Court, presided over by Judge Patricia Alvarez, a jurist with a reputation, according to Grace, for running her courtroom with almost military precision and very little patience for theatrics from either side. Grace and I prepared for that hearing across 6 weeks of what she called, only half-joking, deposition triage, narrowing 11 months of filings down to the specific sequence of facts that would matter most in a single day. 3 days before the hearing, Grace filed, under seal, a motion requesting judicial review and limited declassification authorization for the 2011 after-action report, supported by a sworn declaration from Brigadier General Marcus Webb, now retired, who had commanded the task force in Kandahar, and who, when Grace called him personally to explain the situation, said only, "Send me what you need signed, and tell Rebecca I never once thought this day wouldn't come." I did not sleep the night before that hearing, not from fear exactly, but from the specific, wide-awake alertness I remembered from the nights before deployment, the sense of a body preloading itself for something it already understood mattered more than sleep. I pressed my dress uniform myself at 11 p.m., the same green service uniform I had worn perhaps 4 times since my medical retirement, and I pinned the silver star and the bronze star with valor and the purple heart to the left breast in the exact order regulation requires, not because Grace had asked me to wear it, she had specifically left the choice to me, but because I had decided, somewhere around February, that if this case was going to be decided on the question of who I actually was, I intended to walk into that courtroom wearing the answer rather than simply speaking it. The morning of May 14, 2025, Courtroom 4 filled up in a way family court hearings almost never do. I counted 11 people in uniform sitting in the gallery by the time the bailiff called the room to order, several of them men I had served alongside in Kandahar and Mosul, informed by Tony Reyes, who had made it his personal mission over the preceding 2 weeks to let every veteran who had ever known me understand exactly what kind of hearing this actually was. My sister Emily sat in the 3rd row, having flown in from Ohio the night before, without telling our parents she was coming, and beside her, in a seat I had not expected and did not ask for, sat my father, Colonel Harold Calloway, in a grey suit rather than a uniform, his hands folded in his lap the entire morning, in a posture I recognized from 30 years of watching him sit through other people's ceremonies without participating in them. Dean arrived with Bradley Simmons at 9:02 a.m., 2 minutes late. Vanessa Doyle seated directly behind him in the gallery in a cream-colored suit that Grace later described, dryly, as dressed for a verdict he did not yet know was coming. Constance Whitfield sat beside Vanessa, her posture perfect, her expression already arranged into the small, patient smile she wore, for occasions she believed she would eventually be proven right about. Bradley Simmons opened the morning's arguments exactly as Grace had predicted he would, walking the court through 11 months of filings emphasizing my medical history, the Holter monitor data taken entirely out of clinical context, and the hospital collapse 40 days earlier, which he characterized once more, in open court this time, as, quote, an incident whose timing this court should weigh carefully against the pattern of medical claims the wife has made throughout this proceeding, closed quote. Judge Alvarez, I noticed, wrote something down without looking up. Grace's cross-examination of Bradley Simmons's own witness, a hired occupational psychologist named Dr. Weldon, who had never once examined me in person and had built his entire assessment off my medical records alone, took 11 minutes and ended with Dr. Weldon admitting, under direct question, that he had no clinical basis whatsoever for characterizing a documented, blast exposure-related cardiac arrhythmia as, quote, potentially psychosomatic or attention-motivated, closed quote, a phrase he had used in his written report and now could not defend under oath. Judge Alvarez asked him, unprompted, whether he was aware that the wife's condition had been independently confirmed by continuous cardiac monitoring, predating the divorce filing by several weeks. Dr. Weldon was not aware, The gallery, 11 veterans and my sister, and, unexpectedly, my father among them, was very quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when it understands something has just shifted. I remember the specific sound of that silence, the low hum of the ceiling fluorescence suddenly audible, the bailiff's chair creaking once as he shifted his weight, Bradley Simmons's pen stopping mid-stroke against his legal pad. I remember, too, the smell of the courtroom, dust and old carpet, and the particular cold antiseptic edge that clings to every county building in the South, in May, before the air conditioning has fully caught up with the morning heat. And I remember thinking, with the same detachment I had once used to catalogue the position of enemy fire, that I would remember this exact combination of sounds and smells for the rest of my life, the same way I still remember, with total and unwanted clarity, the smell of jet fuel and scorched metal outside Kandahar 14 years ago. Dr. Amelia Foster testified next, walking the court through 30 days of Holter monitor data recorded in March of 2024, a full month before Dean filed for divorce, establishing beyond any credible dispute that my cardiac condition existed, was documented, and had never once been fabricated or exaggerated for legal advantage. She described, in clinical but unmistakably clear language, the mechanism by which repeated blast wave exposure in combat produces exactly the kind of arrhythmia I lived with, and she said, in response to a question from Grace, that in her professional opinion, characterizing my medical history as strategic was, quote, not merely inaccurate, but a fundamental misunderstanding of the physiology involved, closed quote. Bradley Simmons's cross-examination of Dr. Foster lasted 4 minutes and produced nothing useful for his case. He sat down looking, for the first time in 11 months, less than fully certain. General Marcus Webb was called at 11:40 a.m., and the gallery, already quiet, went entirely still. He walked to the witness stand in a dark civilian suit, his posture unmistakably that of a man who had spent 34 years standing at attention whether or not anyone was currently ordering him to. Grace's first question was simple. General Webb, can you describe, for the court, the events of April 11, 2011, near Kandahar, and the role that then Captain Rebecca Calloway played in those events? General Webb answered without notes. He described a coalition helicopter downed by ground fire 11 kilometers outside a forward operating base, 2 pilots trapped and wounded, sustained enemy fire preventing standard extraction for nearly 40 minutes, and a decision, made by then Captain Calloway under conditions he described as, quote, some of the worst I witnessed in 3 decades of service, closed quote, to personally coordinate and physically participate in a medevac extraction that pulled both pilots out alive under continuous small arms fire. He testified that the mission had remained classified for over a decade, for reasons entirely unrelated to my conduct, that the classification had recently been reviewed and partially lifted specifically to permit his testimony today, and that the after-action report, now declassified for the limited purposes of this proceeding under judicial order, documented in the government's own words exactly what he was describing under oath. Grace introduced the after-action report into evidence at 12:15 p.m. Judge Alvarez read portions of it herself, silently, for nearly 3 full minutes, a silence that stretched long enough that even Bradley Simmons stopped writing. When she looked up, she asked General Webb one final question. General, in your professional judgment, based on 34 years of service, and your direct command of the events described in this document, would you characterize Major Calloway's military career as, and I am reading directly from the respondent's own prior filing, quote, an admin position that got lucky with a medal somewhere along the way, closed quote. General Webb did not raise his voice. He said, no, Your Honor, I would characterize it as one of the most decorated and dangerous combat support careers I witnessed in 3 decades in uniform. And I would add that the person who wrote that sentence has clearly never once read a single page of what I am holding in my hand. He set the folder down on the rail of the witness stand with a small, deliberate motion, and the sound of that single folder meeting varnished wood carried across the entire room the way a gavel does. And for a moment, nobody in that gallery, not the veterans in the 3rd row, not Emily, not even my own father, made a single sound. Judge Alvarez asked, before excusing General Webb, whether the declassification order covered the full report or only the portions already summarized in his testimony. Grace confirmed the order covered the complete report, 22 pages, including 2 photographs taken during the extraction itself, both of which she had, per the sealed order's terms, provided only to the court and not to the gallery. Judge Alvarez looked at those 2 photographs for close to a minute in total silence, then closed the folder and set it precisely at the center of her desk, squared to the edge, the way I imagine she squares every piece of evidence that has actually changed her mind, rather than merely supported an argument she already expected to make. Bradley Simmons's own words, spoken in a hallway 2 months earlier and preserved in Grace's contemporaneous memo, entered the record moments later, when Grace asked him directly, under oath, whether he recalled describing me, in a conversation with opposing counsel outside this very courtroom, as someone who was, quote, never really a soldier, just an admin who got lucky with a medal, closed quote. Bradley Simmons's face changed color in a way I have genuinely never seen a human face change color before. He attempted to characterize the statement as an informal remark taken out of context. Judge Alvarez asked him whether he was aware, at the time he made that remark, that the woman he was describing held a silver star for an action that had, at that point, still been sealed for reasons of national security rather than obscurity. Bradley Simmons said he had not been aware. Judge Alvarez said, for the record, that she found that lack of awareness troubling, given how confidently the characterization had been deployed throughout 11 months of filings. Dean testified last, at 1:30 p.m., and I watched him take the stand with an expression I had spent 11 years learning to read and had never once, until that afternoon, seen fully collapse in public. Grace's questioning was patient and precise. She walked him, minute by minute, through the 40-hour window between my hospitalization and his authorization of the emergency motion, suggesting I had faked my own cardiac event. She asked him whether he had visited the hospital. He said no. She asked him whether he had called. He said no. She asked him whether, at the time he authorized that motion, he had reviewed any of my actual medical records, including the Holter monitor data recorded a full month before he filed for divorce. He said no. She asked him, finally, whether he had ever, in 11 years of marriage, asked me a single direct question about what happened to me, in either Kandahar or Mosul. Dean was silent for 11 full seconds, the exact length of silence my mother once held at our wedding, and then he said, quietly, no, I don't think I ever did. Judge Alvarez's ruling, delivered from the bench at 2:50 p.m., took 20 minutes and dismantled, point by point, every foundation of Bradley Simmons's 11-month strategy. She found no credible basis whatsoever for characterizing my medical condition as fabricated, strategic, or relevant to my parenting capacity, and she noted, specifically, that the respondent's own conduct in authorizing an emergency motion 40 hours after his wife's documented cardiac event demonstrated, quote, a troubling willingness to weaponize a genuine medical crisis for tactical advantage, closed quote. She awarded me primary physical custody of Jacob, denied any modification of the survivor benefit plan election, ordered the marital home sold with proceeds split according to standard equitable distribution, rather than the aggressive split Dean had sought, and, in a final line that landed in that gallery like a physical object, stated for the record that the court found Major Calloway's military service record, quote, not merely honorable but frankly extraordinary, closed quote, and that any future characterization of that service in this or any related proceeding should reflect the documented facts now entered into evidence, rather than the assumptions this court had watched unravel in real time over the course of a single afternoon. I did not cry when Judge Alvarez read that ruling. I have never cried in front of Dean, or Constance, or Bradley Simmons, or anyone in that gallery, and I did not intend to start on the one day it would have mattered least. What I did instead was turn, slightly, in my chair, and look at my father, sitting in the third row in his grey suit, and watch him do something I had not seen him do in 31 years of knowing him. He stood up. Not for a salute, not for any tradition I recognized, just standing, alone, in a courtroom, looking at me the way I imagine he must have looked at his own commanding officers exactly twice in his career, and he said nothing at all, because there was, for the first time in his life, genuinely nothing left for him to correct. Judge Alvarez's final procedural note, delivered almost as an aside, just before she adjourned the hearing at 3:10 p.m., was the one that Grace later told me she would remember longest. She looked directly at Bradley Simmons and said that going forward, any filing in her courtroom characterizing a party's military service, medical history, or professional record should be supported by actual evidence rather than assumption, and that she trusted counsel understood exactly why she felt the need to say that out loud in open court on this particular afternoon. Bradley Simmons said yes, Your Honor, in a voice noticeably smaller than the one he had used at 9:02 that morning. Dean did not say anything at all. He sat very still, looking at the folder still squared on the judge's desk, and I watched him understand, in real time, that the version of himself he had built his entire adult identity around, competent, in control, the managing partner who always found an angle, had just come apart in front of 11 veterans, his own mother, and the woman he had spent 11 years failing to ask a single real question. Consequences arrived for each of them on their own separate timelines over the following 4 months, and I want to be specific about each one, because vague justice is not satisfying, and these particular consequences were not vague. Dean's malpractice concealment surfaced formally in July of 2025, when Priya Nair's forensic report, entered as supplemental evidence in the property division phase, revealed the 14-month-old $190,000 settlement he had hidden under a consulting fees line item, a disclosure violation serious enough that the North Carolina State Bar opened a formal grievance investigation in August of 2025. 2 of Whitfield and Marsh's remaining 11 partners voted, in a closed-door meeting Dean was not permitted to attend, to remove him as managing partner in September of 2025, citing, in the language of the internal memo Grace later obtained through discovery, quote, "a pattern of judgment inconsistent with the fiduciary standards this firm requires," closed quote. Vanessa Doyle moved out of the Providence Roadhouse in October of 2025, 3 weeks after Dean's demotion became public knowledge among the firm's clients, and she has not, to my knowledge, spoken to him since. Constance Whitfield stopped attending the country club's Thursday bridge group sometime that same fall, after, according to Emily, who still hears from a mutual acquaintance, at least 2 of the other members made pointed remarks about the courtroom testimony that had, by then, made its way through every legal circle in Charlotte. Bradley Simmons's firm quietly declined to renew Dean's referral relationship in November of 2025. I take no particular pleasure in any of this. I simply notice, the way I have been trained for 19 years to notice things, that consequences, delayed long enough, tend to arrive all at once. Emily called me in September of 2025, crying in a way I had genuinely never once heard my younger sister cry, not even at our own grandmother's funeral, and told me she had spent her entire adult life assuming the family's version of me, the paperwork version, the administrative version, was simply the truth, because nobody had ever once presented her with a reason to doubt it, and that sitting in that gallery in May and watching General Webb set that folder down had been the first time in 30 years she had ever actually looked at me, rather than at the story our parents had built around me. I told her it wasn't her fault. She said it partly was, and I did not correct her, because I have learned, slowly and at some cost, that letting people sit honestly with their own complicity is usually more useful to them than comforting them out of it too quickly. My mother has never apologized directly, not in the specific, spoken way my father eventually managed. What she did instead, in November of 2025, was mail me a photograph I had never seen before, taken by an army photographer at a change of command ceremony in 2016 that I did not even remember being photographed at, showing me at attention, and on the back, in her handwriting, 4 words. I kept this one, nothing else. I understood it for exactly what it was, which was not an apology, but an admission that she had, in fact, been paying more attention than she ever let on, and had simply chosen, for 30 years, to file that attention away, somewhere she didn't have to act on it. Tony Reyes retired from the Guard himself in December of 2025, and at the small gathering afterward, he pulled me aside near the parking lot, still in uniform, and told me that walking me down that aisle in 2014 had been the easiest order he ever gave himself, because he'd spent 2 years watching me carry other people out of worse rooms than any chapel, and it had never once occurred to him that I'd need someone to carry me into one. I told him he hadn't carried me. He'd simply stood there so nobody else could pretend they hadn't seen what was standing beside me. He said that was fair, and we didn't say much else, because some things between people who have served together don't need the extra words, and I have always found that particular silence more honest than almost anything spoken in a courtroom. My father called me in January of 2026, 7 months after the ruling, and asked, for the first time in his life, whether I would tell him about Kandahar. Not the version in the after-action report, the version that lived in me. I told him some of it. Not all of it, because some of it is not his to have, but some of it, for the first time, and he listened the entire way through, without correcting a single detail, which is the closest thing to an apology my father has ever offered anyone in his life. Dean sent a letter in February of 2026, not through Bradley Simmons, not through any attorney, just a handwritten letter that arrived at the Providence Road house I now own outright. And in it he wrote that he understood, now, that he had spent 11 years married to a woman whose life he had never once been curious enough to ask about, and that the not asking had cost him more than the divorce settlement ever could. I have not fully forgiven him. I am not certain I need to, in order to move forward. But I read that letter twice, and I put it in the same grey filing box that once held a sealed envelope from 2011, because some things deserve to be kept, even after you no longer need them to prove anything to anyone. If there is one thing I would ask you to carry out of this story, it is this. The people who love you the least are very often the ones who are the most certain they already know exactly who you are, and the people who love you the most tend to be the ones still quietly asking. Who in your life have you underestimated, simply because they never once bothered to correct you? Jacob asked me last week whether he could tell his history teacher what I actually did in the army, because apparently there's a unit coming up on modern conflict and history, and he wants to bring in something real, something that actually happened, not a textbook paragraph. I told him he could tell her whatever he wanted, because for the first time in 19 years, I am no longer the one deciding who gets to know, and there is a particular, quiet relief in that, a relief I never once expected to find on the other side of a courtroom, a hospital bed, and a locked grey box I kept sealed for far too long.